You are in Turkey, you are on these lands, and you have no interest in the political thought produced in your own lands. Let's not say Islam, let's say Ottoman, let's say Turkish thought, Turkish political thought. There is no interest in that either. Unfortunately, it does not turn into a lesson format.
Hello everyone from Istanbul School. Dear audience, we continue to talk about Islamic political thought. Our guest is Prof. and Dr. Özgür Kavak. Welcome, Haja.
We are welcome.
How are you?
Thank you. How are you?
Thank you very much. Professor, we talked about the sources of Islamic political thought in our previous program. We would like to talk a little bit about how these are perceived today. In other words, when we look at it in general, we cannot see Islamic political thought as a course in faculties and academies. As someone who has completed a philosophy degree, I would like to say this from my own perspective. We have never taken a course on Islamic political thought. It may be Islamic philosophy, we have seen these from other perspectives, but we have not taken Islamic political thought as a course. Why is this so? Is it like this in Turkey? How do you see this situation from other perspectives? How would you evaluate it?
In fact, the issue of how a field that we say has such a wide and rich resource pool has been received in different circles in the modern period is important. You have pointed out a good point. Perhaps we can address the issue in this way, both in Turkey and a little bit in the Arab world and a little bit in the Western world if we proceed step by step. In Turkey, the issue actually has three direct sides. The first is the academic field that you mentioned, and there are at least two large departments that this course will be directly related to. The first is the faculties of theology, the other is the faculties of political science. When we look at the whole of Turkey, we see that it has not turned into an academic discipline except for the elective courses opened due to the personal preferences of some professors in these two faculties. While it is possible for this to turn into a course that can be given very easily in faculties of theology, this is not very possible. In fact, there are Islamic law courses in faculties of theology. However, when we look at Islamic law courses, we see that even there, this field that we call public law is passed over very superficially, and that Islamic law is mostly devoted to the field of private law. This is our first observation. Political science, as a science centered on Western civilization, conveys politics. So you start with ancient Greece. After that, the Islamic part we talked about in the last program. The perception of this with Farabi, Ibn Rushdi, Ibn Bachezi, Ibn Sina, and other great political thinkers, as if those in Islamic civilization never came into play. Then there is the understanding that continues on its way with Machiavelli. It may be understandable in the West, but you are in Turkey, you are in these lands, and you have no interest in the political thought produced in your own lands. Let's not say Islam, let's say Ottoman, let's say Turkish thought, Turkish political thought. There is no interest in that either. Unfortunately, it does not turn into a course format. Farabi and Ibn Sinan can be included in the curriculum from time to time. Well, Ibn Haldun can be included in the curriculum. That's it.
We actually had a course on classical Turkish thought, I can say that. Classical Turkish thought can be addressed separately. Turkish philosophy, Turkish thought. I have not seen that we addressed Islamic political thought on its own.
It may be relatively excusable for the philosophy department, but the fact that this cannot be included in a large faculty whose sole business is political science is thought-provoking. We need to talk about the reasons for this, but if we continue with the findings, for example, there are Islamic movements in Turkey. There are movements that identify themselves with the ideology of Islamism, and they also have political projects of some kind. But they do not feed on these sources while producing these political projects. That is, this is a much more interesting thing. In other words, whether any Islamist political movement in Turkey later turns into a party or not, we do not see them making any genuine contact with the classical texts of Islamic political thought and portraying themselves as a kind of continuation of them. There is a great lack of interest there too. Therefore, it has no counterpart both in academia and in movements that are more social. The Turkish leg is like this. If we go to the field of detection, there are some new developments.
Let's say we hope there will be more then, sir.
We hope so. At least we can say that as a positive activity, text production and publication in the field of Islamic political thought has begun. I hope that these will probably become more visible in the coming years if they can impose themselves on the field. But it seems like we have a long way to go for this to become an academic format. The Turkish leg is a bit like that.
Let's say God willing, sir. How about the Arab world? How do you see this?
It is difficult to evaluate the Arab world as a single piece, considering that they live in different regime models, and these models determine their relationship with politics to a great extent. In many countries, talking and writing about politics has become risky. Compared to Turkey, we can at least say that texts on Islamic political thought are visible. For example, there are very few in Turkish. There are 1 or 2 texts. But in the Arab world, there are texts like El-Fikri Siyasi El-Islami. Some of them deal with history, while others deal with more contemporary issues of political thought. In the Arab world, the concept of politics is more closely linked to strategic thought and international relations, but there are at least strong names who think and produce texts on political issues. Also, of course, in regions where the Salafist attitude is widespread, this politics is also heading towards a kind of demonization. At least some Salafi groups see it that way. Salafism is also a single group. I have a small anecdote. When I went to a place in Jordan that sells Salafi books, wholesale books, imagine hundreds of books, very scattered. When I asked the friend there where the politics section was, he said to me in Arabic, "So leave politics, read etiquette, read." I said, "This is my job, excuse me," or something. There is such a view. Of course, this does not take us anywhere, at least. Of course, a slightly different picture emerges in the West. First of all, this has been defined as a very serious academic field. Dozens of texts have been produced. There are courses on Islamic political thought in many universities. I collected the syllabuses of these courses at one point. A friend of ours helped me, thank God. Dozens of texts are being produced, many Islamic political thought books. For example, while we do not have a book in Turkish on Ottoman political thought that covers this from beginning to end, that one was written by a Greek researcher. Here is Ottoman political thought. Of course, there is intense academic interest in the West. Perhaps we can talk about what this interest wants to establish, what it wants to do, what its goal is, or the approaches that stand out in the readings here later. In general, it is not a very encouraging position as a finding.
Yes, it's really sad. We call it Islamic political thought. Neither we nor the Arab world have enough of it, but the West has embraced it and continues to do so. As you said, we don't know what its purpose is or what kind of results it will achieve, but we are trying to read it again by taking it from the West.
Of course, of course. The first books on Islamic political thought in this country were translated from the West, so the literature seems to have been produced there a little bit.
So why is this so, teacher? We are faced with a very painful picture, but why is this so? Why do we not take ownership of it? How do you see this?
Yes, there are many reasons, but when I think about the reasons for this, specifically the Islamic movements and Islamism that I mentioned earlier, I bring the issue back to the 19th century, and I think we need to look at some reasons outside the context of political thought. There is a situation like this. When the Islamic world began to be defeated as a result of colonial movements, when it began to lose its independence, as you know, different thinkers from different schools of thought sought a solution. Here they asked the following as a basic question. Why did we fall behind and why did we lose? While searching for answers to this question, they first looked at the following. They looked at those who advanced, the West. How did the West advance? That it defeated us. This question was asked. I am talking about Islamist intellectuals. Everyone asks this, but I will proceed a little bit through the answers of the Islamists. Here, the following historical perceptions emerged regarding the West. First, the West has a dark age, the Middle Ages. I am explaining their perception. Its compatibility with the reality is a separate issue. The West also specifically chooses the concepts of the Church's tyranny. While living in a dark age under the tyranny of the Church, they separated religion from the world. That is, by carrying out reform movements, they confined the field of religion to one place. They started to organize the world with different criteria. This was called reform. After this separation, such a new educated generation emerged, who were aware of the importance of the virtue of reason. This new educated generation established their law and politics by centering that reason and being largely free from the influence of religion. And the model they established led them to a democratic regime model. Democracy is therefore an indispensable condition for progress and development. Now this is the picture, right or wrong. Now if we return to the question of why we have fallen behind, but the fact that the door has been opened to democracy probably conveys a picture that I will connect the issue with politics. Now we have turned to us, we do not have a church, but now we have to reach it by going through similar historical processes. When they ask what else is there, they found two important scapegoats here. Islamists find this. In other words, people who have the idea that we will not give up Islam, but returning to a true understanding of Islam will only save us. Because if it were Western, there would be no need for these direct analyses. In other words, there would be no need for it to go on this long. You will both remain Muslim and you will show that it is not Islam that is holding you back, that Islam is not an obstacle to progress, but our understanding of Islam. By renewing that understanding, you need to establish a new model of law and politics, and this model will follow the one in the West. Now, the first question is, there is no church. What is there? There are two big problems. First, the field of law. I am talking about this reading. The field of law is being dominated by sects that we call denominations. The door of ijtihad is being closed. You must be very familiar with these movements because Islamists, in the Islamist circles in Turkey, they still use these discourses. So you will not find it strange.
Yes, yeah. Still talking about things that are actually...
When this door of ijtihad is closed, a phenomenon called taqlid begins. This starts in the 4th century, that is Hijri. Therefore, the Islamic world almost stops thinking. And what do sects cause? They cause the Islamic society to be divided and cause conflicts. This enters the world as a kind of social disease. What is another thing that goes hand in hand with this? It is the abandonment of our political model during the period of the Rashid Caliphs when it had democratic principles, and I quote, democratic principles by the Umayyad dynasty. The Rashid Caliphate model was actually suitable to be a democratic model, but the Sultanate prevented this and political tyranny emerged. That is what we call the dark age of the church, and they equate it with these two. There are so many problems that this cannot explain, but we are not talking about the truth of it now. This is the first stage. So what are we doing then? After a period of about 30-40 years, we have completely entered a dark age. While the Middle Age was at least a certain period, this is the whole history of Islam.
Trapping us in a completely dark age.
Now, when you do this, you render meaningless all the centuries in which these texts, which I call the sources of Islamic political thought, were produced. And those texts already become worthless for you. Moreover, we encounter many discourses that stigmatize these texts and the people who produce them.
Yes, it actually means dismissing an entire oeuvre.
You are pushing, and moreover, it is said. For example, Islam has not developed public law in any way. These issues have never been discussed. The issues of caliphate and imamate were discussed only as the sultans allowed them to be discussed. Around the palace, in the words of a famous Islamic jurist, he even says something like this kind of fiqh feeding. He uses the expression of the representative of fiqh that they feed in the palace. The great ulama we know. Therefore, all of them, including Al-Ghazali, Mavi-Erdi, and Ibn Taymiyyah, are actually texts of great political thought in that great century, texts produced in that dark age. It is meaningless for you to look back at them. Then there is no political thought to be derived from them. In this picture, of course, we can extend this picture even further, but if I go through it quickly, some new attempts are being made to distinguish between religion and the world. Normally, in fiqh, there is a concept called amal, and since this amal refers to all kinds of your behavior and words, it is not possible in the classical world to construct the distinction between religion and the world in a way that is subject to different ahkam. But in order to make a distinction similar to those reform movements in the Western model, a new discourse emerges. The method of fiqh is denied, rejected, and set aside, because it produces an imitative fiqh model. Instead of the word reform, new concepts such as islah and tajdid emerged, and finally they came to the conclusion that the political model that Muslims should establish in this age is democracy, and they read Islamic history accordingly. For example, You are trying to find some democratic principles from the time of the Prophet. Interesting discourse strategies are developed here. Hadiths, for example, are taken in a selective manner. They take only the part of a hadith that is useful to them.
A cover is actually being prepared there.
There was definitely such a democratic model, and it has been deactivated. We need to go back to it. The succession of the Rashid caliphs is explained by some kind of democratic principles, consciousness, principles of mezverat, and so on. But for example, it means that all the Rashid caliphs were related to each other. They seem to ignore many other factors, such as the fact that they were only from the Quraysh tribe. After that, or the fact that Hazrat Abu Bakr was replaced by Hazrat Umar. They are all interpreted in a different way, but the main concern is to move to the new democratic model, because he thinks that the Islamic world will save it. This is the main issue. That is why there is a great lack of interest in the field of political thought, because it's like a pool of resources produced by the model of sultanate and despotism. I mean, let's give credit where it's due. In the hands of Islamic historians and Ottoman historians, this political thought is actually more alive. I am talking about Islamic jurists and Islamists who are interested in political science. Most of them do not pay attention to this field in that sense. There is such an issue. When this first emerged, there was a fire. The Islamic world was on fire. Some temporary solutions were produced, but today there is still no point in following such a discourse that completely stigmatizes the past and ignores many achievements. Today, especially in new interpretations, there are actually new interpretations such as the fact that the relationship between law and politics was constructed in a very meaningful way within Islamic civilization. The idea of the rule of law was very firmly established, and many mechanisms for the checks and balances of power were developed. But unfortunately, this totalizing discourse prevents us from seeing these and continues to make this field not such a noteworthy field. We probably need to come to terms with this first. I mean, this is no longer a fire sale. I mean, we are living in a new era. We have now entered the age of nation states. I mean, we are not in a period where we are constantly losing territory and losing wars. I think we have the opportunity to sit down a little more and make contact with the past in a cooler way. At least we need to get rid of this perception quickly. Of course, for this, it is necessary to feed this with a number of texts. This field needs to be more qualified.
Yes, what we need most.
And for example, let's say that it is clear that many texts produced in the field of theology do not really appeal to political scientists, because they are filled with too much Islamic terminology. When we produce a language and at least process and explain this political aspect, the political aspect within this entire pool of resources a little more in the language of political science, we probably need to do something. In other words, we will make a little more progress. Therefore, the sackcloth is a little... We also need to screw the professors working in this field. In other words, this field needs to be nourished a little more. I guess we need to do academic studies that will undermine the cliched acceptances in this field, the despotic discourse, the discourse that public law has never developed, and feed this with new approaches.
In this sense, we would like to thank you for your contributions to the literature.
Hopefully mine is actually an external contribution. There is a great need for academics who will feed this field, especially those who will come from the field of political science.
Yes, I hope we will raise awareness on this occasion. Thank you very much, teacher.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dear audience, we talked about the current reception of Islamic political thought. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.